Hi everyone. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through how to use this business valuation calculator. Now, the first thing I want to highlight is that there are written instructions here, step-by-step instructions. So if you prefer to follow written text rather than to watch or to listen, that's absolutely fine. It's all here for you. The second thing as well is that there is a disclaimer to this, which is none of the results that you produce through this calculator constitute in any shape or form financial, legal, or investment advice. Use it as your guidelines, absolutely, but none of it is concrete advice. So just keep that in mind. Now let's jump straight over to the valuation calculator. Now, business valuation is not always as complex as it can seem, certainly from the outside. Fundamentally, when we value a business, we are looking at the business's previous performance, and also we like to have a little look into the future to where we think the business is going to go and what we think it's going to do from a financial perspective. And I'll go on to explain that in just a little bit more detail. But when it comes to valuing a business, the previous historic data is already there for you. Like, we don't really have to think about this. So when we are engaging with a seller or sellers of a business, one of the first questions we ask around the financial side of things is, can they send us their previous 3 years accounts? Now, the reason we want to do this is because those 3 years accounts contain all the information that we need for evaluation. So quite often it's getting those accounts and then simply looking for the year 2023. What was the revenue? Was it a million? Great. What was it for 2022? Also a million. What about 2021? 900,000. So already, like, we're starting to build out and use this calculator, and we quite simply work our way through those previous financial statements and just input the data. So the financial statements will have the operating expenses for the year. You just put that in, number zero. We'll do the same there. Let's stick an extra zero on that one. And the same there. It will also have the depreciation, amortization, interest expenses, and taxes. So all we are doing is just filling out the previous 3 years. It's actually very straightforward. Now, where it becomes a little bit more complicated, and I'm using that very lightly here because I don't think this is overly complicated, but it's when it comes to looking at what we think the business is going to do in its current or next financial year. So at the time of recording, it's October 2024. Now, if I'm looking at a business and valuing a business, the financial accounts may actually only be made up to the year end in 2023, in which case I've got no financial data from the end of the year 2023 for 2024. I've got no data to fill out here. So what I want to do when I'm engaging with sellers is to also get an indication on what has the business done in this financial year. Now, there's a very important reason why I like to include a 12-month forecast into the valuation. So this column here, column F. The reason why is because a lot of business owners, when you are speaking with them about the potentially buying their business, quite often you will hear phrases and things like, next year is going to be my best year ever. We've done all of this. Next year is going to be fantastic. And so when it comes to valuing a business, if you only value their business based on their previous performance, then the sellers of these companies can get quite not annoyed, but they can get quite defensive that the valuation doesn't incorporate any of the hard work that they've done in like this financial year or previous years that will have an impact. And I do understand where they're coming from. I've had this in companies where we've had a lot of development, a lot of changes that we've done within the business, and those changes haven't quite reflected yet in the finances because it takes time, for those changes to start having an effect. So I like to include a 12-month forecast, which is this column here, which basically incorporates those changes and helps to get a more rounded and accurate valuation on the business. And I also find that it tends to temper those conversations with sellers quite a lot. So they're not as defensive if they can see that a valuation that you've generated does at least incorporate the next 12 months. Anything more than 12 months, then it just becomes a little bit unrealistic, but the data is just not known enough. So 12 months is more than enough. So in this scenario, I've got the previous 3 years of accounts for this business, and looking at the 2024 forecast, speaking with the seller, I'm estimating that they're going to do 1.2 million in revenue, and I'm estimating that the operating expenses have gone up by 100,000. And so we start to fill this out. And what we get here for each of the years is the EBITDA. So the EBITDA is basically what money a business is making, like the real profit when you take out all of the expenses and all of the other surplus of like outgoings such as interest, etc. That gives you an EBITDA. Then we look at, once we have the EBITDA for each year, we look at the average. So in this case, we've got 400,000 for 2021, 500,000 for 2022 and 2023, and 600,000 for 2024, the year. So the average there across all of these years is an average EBITDA of 500,000. Now, I've purposely kept the currencies off this. So as you can probably tell, I'm based in the UK, but I have a lot of people who will be looking at this and watching this and using this tool in different countries. So feel free to add your own currency here, whether it's British pounds or US dollars or whatever that may be. So we've got the average EBITDA. So in this case, it's 500,000 basically. Then we look at the industry multiple. Now, this is the area of evaluation that is normally where a lot of conversation is had between you and the seller, because the seller quite rightfully will want to get their multiple as high as possible. So very often you hear sellers say, oh, it's a 5 times multiple in my industry. But what they are not seeing is that when they see businesses sell in their sector, typically those businesses are much larger. Like you're talking many, many millions of annual revenue. When you're dealing with small businesses, like the multiple doesn't apply in most cases. So to give you an example, a marketing company that's doing 5 million in revenue and has an EBITDA of say 1 million will probably sell for a multiple of 5 to 6 times. But if you're looking at a marketing company that does 500,000 in revenue and makes 75,000 in EBITDA, then you're probably looking at somewhere closer to 2 or maybe 3. Now you can see already how much of an impact the multiple has on the overall value of a business. So just going from 3 to 5 adds an extra million to the valuation, and that's with no other numbers changing. So both the buyer and the seller have strong incentives to get a multiple that works in their favor. Buyers want to get multiples as low as possible, and sellers want to get their multiple as high as possible. And the best way of looking and sort of agreeing on a multiple is really to look at what other businesses, like similar sized businesses in a sector, is selling for and has been selling for. And that will give you a more accurate and realistic idea on the multiple. But as a general rule of thumb, when you're dealing with businesses below 1 million in revenue, realistically, you're most likely looking at multiples between 2 and 4. And 4 is really the very high end of that. Like quite commonly, the multiples between 2 and 3. So just keep that in mind. So once we filled out this data and put in the multiple, then we have our valuation. It's quite simple as that. Now, what I like to do is when I'm valuing a business, I'm always mindful that the value that I'm putting on the business is not set in stone. What I'm looking for is a range. So I might look at a business and keeping all of these numbers the same. I might say, okay, what would be the value of this business at a 2 times multiple? So using this example, I've got 1 million there. What about if it is a 3 times multiple? I've got 1.5 million. Now, if I'm negotiating with a seller, then I would have in my mind and I would discuss with the seller that the valuation is somewhere between a 2 to 3 times multiple. If I had a 2.5 times multiple, then we got 1.25 million. So I would just keep that in mind, because ultimately, when it comes to agreeing a valuation with a seller, especially sellers of small businesses, and in my definition, that's anything below sort of 3 million in annual revenue, then the ultimate value really comes down to what a buyer is prepared to pay for it and what a seller is prepared to sell for. From the many hundreds of conversations I've had with sellers around potentially buying their businesses, not to mention the many businesses I've acquired and sold myself, that I have found has been probably the conclusion of small business valuation. So keep that in mind. Now, on this calculator, there is an example valuation with all of the data filled out, so you can see all of that there. And I've also included a glossary if you're not quite sure on any of the terms, and a FAQ in case you've got any pressing questions. So with that being said, this is basically it. It's a relatively simple tool, but it's very powerful and will help you get to valuations quite quickly. The final thing I'm going to say on this is that this valuation calculator is based on a EBITDA multiple method. Now, there are many ways that you can value a business. The methods that you use, so the way that you value a business, does change from business to business, sector to sector. But the large majority of small businesses that we will certainly be looking at will be using this calculation, a multiple of EBITDA. So don't get worried if you see stuff like cash flow discounting and other forms of valuation. They're slightly different. This is the one that you're almost certainly going to be using, and I really would say in like 95% of the time, this is the calculation. So yeah, I hope you find the tool useful. If you have any questions, feel free to send me a message on any of my social profiles, and I will see you in the next video.